Welcome back to Before the Day Ends. Glad you're with us today. We are in Matthew 24, and again, this is a very difficult part of Matthew. It's kind of the apocalyptic literature section, and I want to say that we can't cover everything we want to cover with apocalyptic literature in this short video. I will say that there's much more we can talk about, but we can at least get some concepts together. So we'll deal with that a little bit, talk about Matthew 24. I do want to say that one of the things with apocalyptic literature is people often think of it as future telling, that there's these hidden secrets, hidden images. If we know the code, we'll be able to answer questions we're asking that maybe they weren't asking. But in reality, the images that we have in apocalyptic literature are meant to call back a previous time and how God helped us in a previous time. A way to think about that is like this. Imagine you're looking outside and you see a couple mountains. And obviously one is in front of the other, but you don't know how far in front. So you look at the side and you'll see that, in fact, they are quite far apart. Well, sometimes one image is talking about it in this kind of literature is that there's this image and this image seen together, but they're often far apart. And what we're looking for is how did God act in this time and in this time to help us then in our time. So again, the images are meant to call back how God helped us here and then here. So, in this first time, and then in the second time, and then into our time. A good example of this, and it's kind of weird, is from the TV show Star Trek: The Next Generation. In this story, Captain Picard finds himself on a planet with one other person, and they're kind of marooned there. And this person and his people only talk in stories. So he says to Picard, Darmok and Jalad on Tanagra. I'm kind of embarrassed I actually remember that, but that's what he says, and Picard has no idea what he's talking about because he doesn't know Darmok or Jalad or where Tanagra is. He doesn't know what happened to those two people on that planet or that location in the story, so he can't relate at all to who he's talking to. Now, if he knew the story of Darmok and Jalad, then he could at least understand what was being said, but he can't. He needs to know the stories. So apocalyptic literature expects you and I to know the stories it refers to, so when it pulls in an image, let's say from Daniel or Isaiah or Zechariah, it pulls in that image, we pull with it everything else. Like if I said Romeo and Juliet, you're going to pull in stories of romance, or maybe sacrifice, or maybe even for you foolishness. But whatever it brings to you is going to be this if you know the story. So Matthew 24 is kind of full of that kind of imagery, that kind of storyline. So let's take a look here at this story. We'll begin in verse 1. As Jesus came out of the temple, he was going away. So he's leaving the Temple Mount, right? His disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. So they're sitting here and they're leaving, and they look back at the temple itself, which is this huge, magnificent structure that was expanded and built upon by Herod the Great. And so now it's just very large. It dominates the city. It's walled. It's protected. It's it's just a dominating place on a hill, on a mountain that the whole city kind of looks up to. Huge, magnificent, structure. So they see this and say, "How great is that?" Right? This is where God has His place. And by the way, this is the second temple. There was a first one that was destroyed by the Babylonians. This is the second temple. Jesus then turns to them and says this in verse 2. Then he asked them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I tell you, not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." So do you see all this? It's not going to be here. Of course, their question is going to be, when? So let's take a look at what's going on. First off, there's a couple references here that are very, very important. So like I said earlier, we had initially the first temple destruction by the Babylonians, which we can read about in the book of Isaiah, and especially like Ezekiel. And we have in there that when the first temple was destroyed, so here's the first temple, it's in Jerusalem, and then you have this valley of the Kidron Valley, then the Mount of Olives. It says that when God was allowing the Babylonians to destroy the first temple, it said that God left and sat on the Mount of Olives and left there. And then That's kind of it. You're going to see that in the book of Isaiah, in the book of Ezekiel. Then it says in the book of Zechariah, chapter 14 in particular, when God comes back, he's going to come back where? Mount of Olives and return. Okay? So again, the Mount of Olives, this area here is kind of the launching off point for God leaving and God returning to the temple. So, Jesus is leaving the area with his disciples. He's on the Mount of Olives, which becomes this very, very important image of God's return to the temple at the end of days, but also his leaving. So, Jesus is leaving, and then we're going to pull in these images from the first temple destruction. All right. By the way, if you go to Jerusalem today, you'll see kind of here on this side of things, there's a place in David's Archaeological Park where there's stones on the ground that were thrown down by the Romans in 70 AD. So this temple was destroyed in AD 70 by the Romans, and it has never been rebuilt, obviously rebuilt since. So, and here's some pictures I'm going to show you of these stones. So it was destroyed by the Romans in 70. Now, in Matthew's day, we'll say that Matthew's in about the 80 or 90 AD period, this has already happened. So, but there is persecution going on in their day. And then there's going to be persecution at what would be the end of the world. So I'll call it like this, end of the world. And so we're looking at this time, the time of the disciples, right, before going to 70 AD, the time after the disciples of this destruction has already happened here. And so now also looking toward the end of the world. So you've got, a mountain, and then another mountain, and another mountain that are all kind of sitting together like that. Okay? So the question it becomes is, well, when's this going to happen? When's this going to happen? As far as any kind of suffering for Matthew's community, what about us? And then there's one more time of suffering that this is going to talk to, and that is yours and mine. What is our end of the world, right? Because when we die, when we are in those moments where we're looking at the end of our world, all these images would apply to that as well. So again, mountain on top of mountain on top of mountain on top of mountain with the same image of, and it's this hope. That as God helped his people through this one, he'll help them through this one, and then he'll help us as well. And all those emotions from these previous times are going to be pulled forward in the Gospel of Matthew. That's kind of what's going on. So we have the first temple destruction, the return of God, and now we're going to get another image that's in this chapter 2. We're not going to go verse by verse through this today, but I want to say there's another big time of suffering, and that's at the hands of this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes IV. And he was Greek, or technically Seleucid, and he caused great suffering on the people. He burned Torah scrolls, he killed them, he killed families, he tore down the walls of Jerusalem, he raided the temple. All these terrible things that people saw as a tremendous time of suffering at the hands of the Greeks. So again, we had suffering with the first temple, suffering at this period we're talking about here in a second, this time of the Greeks. Also, by the way, I want to not overlook this. When the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, Josephus said that 1.1 million people died when they destroyed Jerusalem. So, and that allows from starvation, under siege, all that kind of stuff. And Jerusalem was actually completely razed to the ground. So these are times of tremendous suffering. Again, this was the Romans, and this is the Greeks. So let's go back to this one here. Again, this is at 200 BC. So 200 years before Jesus is we have this suffering here. And it's referenced in Matthew. So let's look now at Matthew 24. We're going to skip ahead just a little bit. So here, for example, in verse 15. So when you see the desolating sacrilege standing in the holy place, that is the temple, as was spoken by the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. So here in Matthew 15, he's referring to this guy, Antiochus Epiphanes. He said, let the reader, hey reader, this isn't secret or hidden. Remember that whole stuff with Antiochus? Well, it's recorded for us in the book of Daniel. And we're going to talk about that some other time, but the book of Daniel is the history of this guy in large. So he's saying, I'm going to talk about that now in this section here about fleeing and the suffering to come and how bad it's going to be. It's going to be bad. In fact, later on, we have the return. Let's see here. In verse 29, did I skip it? Yeah, here it is. So, verse 29, immediately after the suffering of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven will be shaken. Now, verse 30, this is where it gets important. Then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven, and then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So what's going on there? Well, obviously that Jesus is returned, and we get this image of the Son of Man. Super important. In Ezekiel, this simply means human. That's what it means. It means human. But by the time of Daniel, it means something much bigger. And we get this idea of what, more than human, but human as opposed to other things. And what I mean by that is we're going to see Jesus is going to identify himself as this. And in fact, we'll see in his trial, he's going to call himself the Son of Man and refers to not just a human, but to this larger image in Daniel. So what are we talking about? So again, he says this. He's going to pull back everything from Daniel that is being brought to light in this section right here. So let's pull this section out, go to Daniel, and we're going to go to Daniel 7, and we're going to see what's being pulled forward there. So let's look to Daniel 7. So Daniel 7, you see here, we have images of these beasts, and this very chaotic water, which we talked about in Genesis, and this very scary scene. And these beasts represent four empires: Babylon, Media, Persia, and eventually the Greeks. So these destroyed the first temple. All of these kind of oppressed the Jewish people. And then we get Antiochus and his Greek friends. And this becomes the worst. In fact, in Daniel, Antiochus is called the little horn. And the idea is he's got authority, but he's a little horn. He just talks a lot, right? What's interesting is that, look at here at verse 8. I was considering the horns when another horn appeared, a little one, coming up among them to make room for it. Three earlier horns were plucked from the roots. Well, Antiochus killed 3 people to get his job. There were eyes like human eyes in this horn, and a mouth speaking arrogantly. Again, that's going to be Antiochus, this horn right here. Then what happens is God's going to show up, and he's going to establish his throne. He's going to have this, kind of bring judgment, right? Because again, when you're suffering, what do you want to happen? You want justice, right? In our world today, there's this kind of almost lack of justice, it seems, right? All this stuff's going on. There's evil in the world, and we're like, when is justice going to come? Well, imagine they're suffering, how bad this is. They want justice. And now God's going to show up. His throne's going to show up, his judgment seat, and there's going to be judgment. In fact, look at verse 11 here. We're right here in verse 11. It says, I watched, then because of the noise of the arrogant words that the horn was speaking. So God is showing up. In this section up here, God is showing up, setting up his court, and this arrogant one is still talking, still making noise, and then he is destroyed. The beast was put to death, and his body destroyed and given over to be burned with fire. Look what happens next. Okay, this last empire is defeated, and then it says here, I saw one, we're in verse 13, I saw one like a human being. That is a son of man. That's what the Aramaic there says. I saw one like a son of man coming with the clouds of heaven. And he came to the Ancient One, that is God, and was presented before him. To him, to him, the Son of Man, was given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, and shall not pass away. And his kingship is one that shall never be destroyed. So the Son of Man is given authority and power and glory for eternity. And the Son of Man, this human, is different than these. These are all beasts and animals, and they're scary and terrifying. But the Son of Man is like human. He has authority and has this representation from God to have authority. Now, what's interesting is back in Matthew, let's go back to Matthew for a second. If you go to the very end of the Gospel of Matthew, we're going to go to Matthew 28. And we're going to look at how Matthew 28 ends here. It's the very end of the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus came and said to them, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." That's the Son of Man. So this image of Daniel and the Son of Man is being pulled forward in Matthew 24, that Jesus is the Son of Man, the hope of Daniel to bring this everlasting authority and everlasting kingdom is going to come through Jesus. So the suffering of AD 70 and the Romans, the suffering that goes on in Matthew's period, the suffering that goes in our lives has the same outcome, and that is hope for the Son of Man to bring justice and hope and peace and God's rule. So again, but the suffering of Daniel is brought forward into the suffering of Matthew, not as look at how bad it's going to be or when it's going to happen. No, instead it's saying look at the hope that God helped us in Daniel. He's going to help us now as well. Okay, one last thing I want to say about this text. In verse 36, so we're going to go back now to Matthew 24 and verse 36. All right. About that day and hour no one knows, neither the angels in heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. So is when an issue for Jesus? No. He doesn't know. So it's not when, it's who you trust in the midst of the when. As you're waiting, or actually, no, I take that back. You're not waiting. You're watching. We are to be active and to be ready. In fact, the rest of Matthew 24 and 25 is about this word right here. Being ready. Being watchful. That our hope is not in the big buildings of the temple. It's not in the government. It's not in other people. Our hope is in the Son of Man, who is coming again, who brings his justice and his kingdom and his compassion with him. And that's where our hope is really going to lie. Are we actually being watchful? And we'll see that in the upcoming stories that Jesus is going to tell about being watchful. Why? Because we are to trust, we are to have faith that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Jesus now. So there's no need to fear when, no need to fear who, no need to fear anything going on around us. As long as we are being faithful and watching for his return and doing the things he wants us to do, then we have hope. I think a lot of us get so caught up in what's going on in the world around us, which is fine. We should be aware of those things, but we almost get so attached to those things we pay attention to the storm and not to the God who's walking on water toward us. That we need to be ones who are focusing our attention on Jesus' authority, on his kingdom. We're citizens of his kingdom first and being good citizens of his kingdom, because that's where our hope lies. So we can have hope in this world because our hope is in a kingdom that is rooted and grounded in the authority of Jesus, the authority of the Son of Man, given by God himself. So we'll continue with this next time, and we'll kind of jump into chapter 25. Have a great week. We'll see you next time before the day ends.